Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast, where we celebrate filmmaking, storytelling and cinema across the island of Ireland. So whether you're a diehard film fan or simply curious about the screen industries, make sure to subscribe so you can catch up on past conversations with creatives like actor and filmmaker Alice Lowe and 3-time Oscar-winning VFX supervisor Richie Bainham. So this February, journalist and academic Naemi Victoria was on the ground at Berlinale, and in a few minutes she'll catch up with director Fil Ieropoulos and writer Foivos Dousos to discuss their docu-feature Uchronia. But now she talks with award-winning director, cinematographer and editor Fanny Texier about her short film A Woman's Place is Everywhere. In this film, identical twin sisters Emilija and Ona have lived in a rent-controlled warehouse loft in Williamsburg, Brooklyn for as long as they can remember. But after the sudden death of their mother, they find themselves on the brink of eviction.
The film is an intimate documentary about two identical twin sisters who are going through an eviction process in the loft that they grew up in Brooklyn.
How did you meet them? Because it is quite like it's a documentary short, and it's such a personal story that you're telling with it. How did you get in touch with them?
Yeah, so I'm actually a really good friend of them, of the twins, and I was pretty much like really close friends with them for years. I live in Williamsburg.
Right.
They lived in Williamsburg, and I was also close to their mom. So through the process of documenting, I would just go back to the loft and just film as the story was unfolding.
Did you know that the theme of motherhood would be so central from the start? Or was that also something that emerged from the footage?
I mean, I knew just because they had just lost their mom, and I think, thankfully, I haven't gone through that yet, but I think just the loss of your mother is such, I think, an unexplainable feeling for most of us who either have gone through it or will go through it at some point. So I just knew that was going to be a big center. Also because their mom kind of represents the loft for them. So not only, like the film is about grieving their mom or not having time and to grieve their mom, and then now they have all these responsibilities, all this legal stuff and paperwork and having to move out. But yeah, their mom represented the space that they grew up in. So because the loft is a character in the film, I kind of knew that motherhood was going to mean different things. And then obviously the backstory of their adoption backstory and their birth mom being sick during their pregnancy and their adopted mom being the best friend and deciding to adopt them was again something that really touched me early on, and I just think it's like such a beautiful thing that you can do. So it's also about friendship in a way. So yeah, I knew that was going to be a center theme, but I didn't know that Ona was going to get pregnant on top of that.
On the topic of documentaries then, what do you love about making documentaries?
I love the challenge of capturing the magic of life, of the reality of life that sometimes is magic or magical, and how that's so hard to do, but yet it's real.
What are the challenges then?
The challenges are that it's just complete chaos. Life is chaos, and the script is unfolding in front of you and you have no control over it. So you're constantly dealing with not knowing where the story is going. When you're actually filming it, you're obviously challenged by sounds. You don't know what's gonna happen, what people are gonna say. Capturing a scene that feels so smooth and effortless can be so extremely challenging, because you also have to make your subjects feel comfortable so that you kind of disappear in the space with them. And I love intimate documentaries so much, because as a viewer you feel so close to the characters, but to feel that, you as a filmmaker behind the camera, you really need to disappear, which is incredibly hard to do, because you're not working with actors, and so they might just feel some type of way or act different in front of the camera. So that's a huge component of making your presence feel super, super minimal and as small as possible, so that people can just be themselves and completely forget about you. And that when that happens, it's kind of magical, but it's so hard.
Wow. Sorry, that was so well put. Thank you. Really
And then
cool.
sometimes you think you're capturing something incredible, or you are.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden there's somebody shutting the door, or
20,000 seagulls.
Yeah, or something happens and you're like, okay, I lost it.
Yeah.
I lost that moment, and sucks.
Yeah, I can imagine. But then on the other hand, it must also be that you probably look at footage and then notice stuff you didn't before. Maybe there's also the other way, when you start planning and then it doesn't go according to plan. There must also be the opposite, right? Where by at a very
Yeah, I mean,
totally.
Totally. You have an intention when you start filming. You're not sure what's going to happen, but you do have an idea of what may or may not happen, and so it's great to have an intention. But yeah, usually a lot of stuff doesn't go according to plan, and that can be great too. And you can capture some really amazing scenes, like in the film. The sisters have a really big fight in the film, and that was obviously not expected. So that was when it happened, I happened to be rolling at that exact moment, and so that was kind of a really rare thing for me to be able to capture them being, and obviously it was not a happy moment for them, yelling at each other, and but it's also so true and so raw and so vulnerable, and that's what makes you want to keep watching, because you're I've fought with my sister too before, and that's what it looks like, and that's real.
Anyone with siblings could relate, yes.
So now Naemi talks with the director Fil Ieropoulos and writer Foivos Dousos about their featured docu-essay inspired by author Rimbaud's Saison on Enfer. There, the French poet's ghost embarks on a time travel adventure.
Thank you so much for taking the time for this interview and for sharing your wonderful film Uchronia, which is a really thought-provoking piece. If we could maybe start this off by you telling us what Uchronia means as a term.
Sure. So Uchronia is the equivalent of utopia, but if utopia talks about space, Uchronia talks about time. So it's almost like a utopia out of time, utopia of the past or of the future. So we like this idea, and it comes from a French philosopher,
Charles Renouvier.
And we also like the idea that he's introduced this concept a few years after A Saison in Hell by Arthur Rimbaud was written. And for us, for this film, basically, A Saison in Hell is the starting point. Is in a broad way, the film is based on the poem by Arthur Rimbaud. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Uchronia is It's this idea that, because utopia essentially in Greek, if you look at the etymology, means no space, of not a particular space. Then Uchronia means of not a particular time. So it is a form of utopia that happens amongst people, like with the past and present and future being kind of fused somehow. And this is in a way what our film does. It is a coming together of people from different times to have an almost an imaginary almost conference amongst each other, talking about what is going to happen with the world and radical politics and queerness and so on.
I think the description of a conference of voices of the past on the present and the future, this kind of like simultaneity, is a really, really interesting point in the film. And I was wondering, what is it like when you look at 20th century writing to draft that into a screenplay that is written at the in the present moment? What was it like to rework these voices into the format of a screenplay?
Yeah, I feel like, first of all, like we were writing this in a very collaborative way. So we decided together like the structure of the film, and then I did the writing, and actually using lots of references from different, writing avant-garde movements. And I feel like what is interesting is, while with literature, with printed text, lots of the experimentations of the modernist era have been kind of embedded in writing culture. I feel like with cinema, there is a little bit of regression, and the writing, like, oftentimes is more kind of repeating certain structures or like archetypical narrative forms in a way that's like less adventurous, I would say. So in this film, I think writing wise, we went against like all script writing conventions. So we have like lots of voiceovers, we have like characters giving lectures during the film, kind of revisiting, what we think is an interesting way to make a film, basically. Yeah.
And I think in terms of the present and past that you're talking about, I think when we decided, because I mean, how did that film start? In a way, this is missing a little bit from what we're discussing so far. Is why did we decide to make a film about Arthur Rimbaud? And the answer to that is that we wanted to look into the rise of fascism in contemporary Europe, and into not just the rise of fascism, but the way that Europeans have forgotten there is always this danger. We almost somehow fell for a trap that now progress is just going to make things better, basically. And we didn't realize that, no, human history doesn't work like that. It works in cycles of progress and regression, basically. And so we started with this premise that we wanted to look into what is going on now. But in order to look at what is going on now, and why doesn't there seem to be a way to look into the future and into into revolution, for example? Why does it sound like such a, I don't know, cliche word or something? We decided to go back to the 19th century, at the time where, doing revolutionary things and looking for the future didn't seem like a cliche. It seemed like the thing that you're supposed to do. And so we would never make a film about the 1870s. We would never make a film about Rimbaud's time. That does not interest us. We don't do this kind of work. We always look at the present and how the past sort of like reflects in the present. This is absolutely important for us. And I think this was what the writing had to struggle with all the time. How do you go from now back to 150 years in 1870 through the AIDS crisis through the Holocaust and the revolutionary 60s and all these different points in queer and radical history. How can all those things like go back and forth? And I think the connections are many more than we understand. Like actually the premise of equality amongst people and revolutionary potential and so on doesn't really change. It is the same thing. We have just somehow forgotten about it.
That is so interesting that because this connection is in the film, and I'm wondering because it felt like it was also interrogating the sense of history as a singular narrative. So where it's more like histories happening at the same time, and these ghosts revisiting us are a reminder of that. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit more about this figure of the ghost.
I mean, the subtitle of the film is Parallel Histories of Queer Revolt. So it is really totally about this idea of writing parallel histories, of writing imaginary histories, of filling in the gaps that the ghosts have left us behind. Maybe you'd like to say more about the idea of the ghost.
Yeah, I mean, in this film, we are very much influenced by the notion of hauntology as developed by Jacques Derrida. And there is a line actually from one of his essays that we use in the film that says, "The future belongs to the ghosts." And there is almost this idea that because there are all these unresolved tensions from all these failed revolutions, there are all these kind of ghosts of the past that they will not let us kind of settle in a present. Almost they will return until they find some justice. And we really love this idea. And obviously, like this concept of hauntology comes back with Mark Fisher to this. So I felt like we are at the time that we live with many ghosts of all these kind of past movements and past failures and past tensions. And also, like, I feel like because of the digital era, there are all these traces of kind of discourses and kind of struggles that they permeate like everything. But like many times not in an explicit way, but in a very kind of like spectral way, like hauntings. I felt like ghosts, and also because ghosts kind of transcend time in a way that Uchronia kind of wants to evoke. I felt like this was like a really, really kind of fun, not fun, but like a kind of potent idea, but also fun because it's nice to have a dinner with ghosts.
No, absolutely. And it's also so present in the form of the film where you have these crackles in the audio and in the visuals as well. So how do you approach something that just by the virtue of its nature kind of resists being captured in a form?
I think from my point of view, like what really attracted us to the original poem, A Season in Hell, is that it's very fragmented and also kind of contains like lots of like different elements. So you have more kind of essayistic elements like the prose poem of Bad Blood, and then you have like songs and you have more traditional poetry, and they all come together in this kind of like assemblage. And I feel like in a way that was also done in the film, like so we have like lots of different elements coming together, creating this kind of almost like a mosaic. And I felt like that does justice both to the poem, but also to the political intention of kind of creating this, almost like a palimpsest of different histories and erased narratives.
And then the palimpsest is it's not just in the text, but it's also in the way that the film is thread together visually.
Yeah.
At all times you see that there is an image being constructed, and you see the edges of the frame, and you see the grain of historical footage or imaginary historical footage. There's the idea of the archive, and what does the archive look like. This is very, very central, and one story written on top of another story, like this kind of thing. And the sound, as you said, all this crackling and all this sort of like tape noise and film noise, and it's almost like someone has opened a box and found all that stuff, basically.
Which is also part of the scenes, right? With Rimbaud. I think it's kind of like framing the narrative. As an academic, I was very thrilled to watch this, and I'll probably, like, if I get the chance, I'll watch it again, because there's so much to unpack in the film, in its visuals, in the narrative, but also to a certain extent I got this feeling of the Uchronia reminding us as the audience that there are limitations to what we can grasp, because it is challenging these singular narratives, these coherent concepts or conceptualizations of truth. And I was wondering if that was one of the intentions.
I mean, I can tell you like that when we were writing this, we made a conscious decision to not hold back, almost like, so we were not worried if this might come off as like pretentious or confusing or overwhelming. We were like, you know what, we will do it as we've envisioned it, and it will have many references, but like not like you don't need to understand all the references. We wanted to create something that will have an emotional impact, even if someone would not, for example, like have like read everything that is referenced. And I feel like from what we've seen after the premiere, lots of people have these reactions. So there are people who said like, oh, I missed some points, but I love the film. Or there are some people who said, oh, actually, this when I went home, I looked up this and or that, so it opens up this kind of space of curiosity for people to explore kind of ideas and historical references, or to check, oh, is this actually historical, or did they make this up, which is a really exciting process. And also like even the fact that someone can kind of go in and out of a film, like at one point you're really engaged and another point you think something. That's great. Like why should like a film be like kind of just like being fully graspable? I don't know. It should create spaces of ambiguity and different readings. And I'm honestly like already kind of receiving readings of the film that we didn't think ourselves. So I feel like that's an exciting process and should be encouraged and should be at the core of a multimedia kind of experience that the film is. Yeah.
It's certainly a conversation starter, I think, right? Because you wouldn't, with this, and also the topics and subject matters, and also the idea of the ghosts, like making that tangible would kind of defeat the purpose, I suppose.
Totally.
One of the threads in the film that I found really fascinating was this idea of queerness, and queerness, the way it's, or like this tension between queerness and what popular culture has made of it. These versions of, maybe commodified versions of queerness and conformity. And because it's such a central element of the narrative, I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you approach the representation of queerness in this film.
Absolutely. It's important also in the context of like our body of work to tell you like our previous film was a documentary called Avant Drag that focused on the queer scene of Athens. like already opened up a conversation about like what queerness is, and like the different types of queer visibility, and like this kind of idea that there is a more kind of respectable kind of queer visibility that oftentimes flirts with assimilating into kind of really horrible things. For example, having, a lesbian leader for AfD in Germany. And there is another kind of type of queerness that is like unapologetically strange and living in the margins and being kind of politically active, which obviously is something that we are more kind of interested in. And I feel like what we, again, following the thread from Rimbaud at the time, like there is basically there's no gay identity pretty much, and like he falls in love with Verlaine, and they create this kind of really passionate and in many ways cursed relationship. But at the same time, they have this idea that they want to create a new way of love, which is a very kind of it's very like powerful kind of idea, and kind of connects to all these different movements, all these different kind of sexual minority movements of the 20th century. Yeah, and I feel like this is a film that is kind of really questioning the idea of assimilation and what is like the end result of respectability politics, basically, and kind of proposes, I guess, a more radical take. And that's like in multiple ways. Like there is queerness that has to do with sexuality and gender, but there's also queerness in terms of how we approach art and creativity. We create something that has a form, like is formally innovative and wild and provocative. So I feel like these are for us a kind of interconnected, I would say.
So with the film, what do you hope it inspires? So you already mentioned audiences' reaction at the premiere. What do you hope that people watching this take away from it, if anything at all? Sorry, handing over to you too.
Yeah, I feel like the biggest thing is that we are kind of facing a generalized sense of like stagnation. Like people feel like they're stuck. There is nothing to be done. We cannot really affect politics. There are all these decisions made for us by kind of oligarchic, like tech companies, and a lot of people are kind of melting into defeatism. And I think our film would like to re-energize a conversation about what is the potential for radical political change in a more kind of 19th century way of thinking about it. Like how can we think of, we can reshape the world? How can we think of revolution, like outside of like a cliche, as Phil said earlier? Like how can we think of revolutionary as something that's still a potential kind of route of action, and yeah, like, and basically go back to the basics of like why do we want to change like society? Why do we want to change the world? Like what is wrong with this world, and like how can we fix it? This kind of stuff, like really big questions. But I feel like the film obviously is not giving a solution to like all of the world problems, but I think we want to reanimate the conversation about the potential for a more kind of ambitious, like politically charged kind of radical action.
And interrogating the present moment, right?
Totally.
I think it definitely felt like asking questions into silences or absences.
Yeah.
And it was, it really, like, but I mean, I got very excited because this is like most of the scholars that, like the snippets were familiar. So it was really, really, really fascinating seeing that translated into the medium of film. But it was also, as you mentioned, somewhat of a, like speeches, but also not, but also, snippets, like alternative histories in a sense, like histories that weren't told,
or like, yeah, kind of like from the past to the present, but also from the present to the past.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking like the other thing is like also kind of what is the role of art and creativity in this process of because I feel like oftentimes we get trapped in language. So the film kind of shows also this kind of process. At the beginning, you know, the characters are trying to make sense of all these issues through like language and like basically lectures. And then as the film progresses, we see the introduction of the idea of desire into this equation. And then we see the dissolution of language, and like we go into this kind of delirious kind of segment of more kind of artistic kind of expression, which I think like is also kind of a way of thinking of, let's say, the libidinal element of politics. So politics is not just what we talk about, but it's also how we feel, how we produce joy, how we produce all kinds of different forms of enjoyment collectively, or like and as people. So I feel like these are important elements that we're trying to, and like speaks to what you said about like it's not just what is said, but also it's not what is not being said. So yeah, totally.
Such a really, really thought-provoking. I have one final content question, just because as I was watching it, how do you think, like, what role does, if there's any role at all, because it's kind of, you know, when you have these like pieces that are questioning concepts, but like, yeah, like asking questions, everything, like I always find myself then questioning everything, in a sense, which is kind of, yeah, like I think part of just thinking about things. But how can we rediscover maybe a future for these forms of protests, for politics from the past? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of does. I feel like for us, a big part was also kind of research, and also like, you know, oftentimes, especially in activist circles, people think that the current like discourse or like the latest kind of political position is just bulletproof. Like we figured everything out and we're ready to communicate it to the world. Whereas interestingly, once we kind of starting studying the 19th century, actually, we found so many kind of exciting ideas and forms of kind of action. So I feel like this kind of Uchronia, you know, talks a lot about the past and brings it to the future. And I feel like that's like a really kind of important work to do with the archive. The other thing is like, because we have the internet, we think that we have access to all information, but it's such like, and increasingly the internet becomes a smaller and a smaller place, and it's packed with like really eroded kind of form of information and like slop and AI kind of shit. And for me, it's really interesting, like how we kind of reanimate the archive and go back to these kind of radical legacies and kind of find what is great about them, you know, and understand like the different moments in history before the 20th century, because oftentimes, especially when it comes to political radicalism, we kind of tend to really focus on the 20th century. I mean, for good reasons. But like, I feel like there is something in the 19th century before like many of these ideas of modernity even settled down like properly. There was more kind of potential for radical creativity in terms of how people thought about transforming society.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Just from because I'll cover like this conversation, like it's kind of like there's a lot to think about, and with film production, I'm just wondering, Phil, what is it like to direct this?
I mean, my background is My research is on poetics and on film that generally goes towards the experimental side, let's say, of cinema. And so for me, the idea that you can take a lot of things that are not necessarily immediately connecting and connect them together as essentially a montage of things is something that I have studied a lot. And I don't mean just academically, also academically, but just watching a lot of films. And it is very important for me that that I edit the films that I do. I always edit the films that I make. I consider myself primarily really an editor and secondarily someone who stages things to be filmed. I still think that the work of a director is very much close to what editing does, and I find it very strange that a lot of people say that they've directed something but they don't edit it. I'm very suspicious of that, and it is also very interesting to see that in the history of film, a lot of important editors have been women, and this is a history that has been very much silenced about all these incredibly important editors who have been, who are not given nowhere near the space of the directors. And so, yeah, for me, queer art is about collage. Queer art is about bringing things together that are contradictory, bringing things together that are far apart, possibly, and connecting them through montage, which, if cinema hadn't gone so spectacularly wrong, we would know already from the 1920s what a powerful tool montage is. There is nothing that I do which Dziga Vertov and his crew of 3 people haven't done already in the 1920s. The language of montage cinema has been out there for 100 years, but we just don't use it. And I think montage is the absolutely queer medium for film. And early queer cinematographers, filmmakers knew that. But somehow the idea of linearity and identification and so on took over, like in the whole of cinema, but even more so in recent queer cinema. It just took over and completely made us forget what we know, that queer lives are complicated and contradictory, and they need collage methodologies in order to make sense. And that's all I do, basically. I take what I understand is queer politics in a deep sense of the meaning and translate that into a film language.
Thank you so much, first of all. That is so interesting, especially editing.
Yeah, I dabbled a bit in it and I found it very challenging at times, because you're kind of there's so much responsibility on you as an editor, because you kind of, that's the film you edit is kind of what people then see, right? It's different to the one that you shoot.
Absolutely.
Would you say that montage in film is the closest we can get to poetry and the space it opens up for interpretation?
I mean, look, I am a little bit biased here because my PhD is on film poetry created through montage. So, so I'm definitely
you can be biased.
Yeah, I think there is a potential in montage to approach psychoanalytical places of the dream and desire in ways that I don't think you can do in many media. And in that respect, I think, yes, film can operate almost at these limits of the symbolic order and kind of into a place where, language just becomes a battlefield of a lot of different things. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think I did my PhD zeros. 2009 is when I finished it. And back then, poetic cinema was considered kind of even naff, I would say, like even kind of cheesy a little bit. And the more we are going towards a totalitarian age where, you know, the world just doesn't make meaning in a straightforward way, the more, you know, contemporary filmmakers are coming into poetics again. They're coming into poetry again. It almost seems a little bit like what happened with Dadaism just before the Second World War. I'm not saying that is a great, you know,
It's that ominous.
yeah, it's a little bit ominous, but you know, this is what happened with Dada. Basically, Dada art was about, you know, that wars have made things not make sense anymore, and like linearity didn't make sense anymore. So we had to escape into a much more poetic and fragmented way of looking at the world. And it feels that now there is a need for that again. And so, yeah, I absolutely support montage as a form of expanded version of poetry.
I think also an interesting thing about poetry and poetics in film, oftentimes when people think of like film poetry, or when I think of film poetry, obviously Phil is an expert, I always tend to think about like abstraction, you know, like something that's really like kind of slow paced and gives time to kind of observe like beautiful images. And I feel like what we try to do is kind of use methodologies of poetry and poetics into very politically sharp kind of work, which I think is an interesting experiment. I'm enjoying it as a creative and as an audience also, and like creates a bit of an awkwardness because we cannot be kind of classified easily, I think, especially in the festival kind of circuits. But it's definitely worth it because I feel like yeah, it's actually a really good kind of synergy when you bring like politics and poetry together. It's quite actually explosive, I could say.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely like it's such a fascinating piece and it's so thought-provoking and it's starting a discussion. And you brought up festivals, the festival and audiences. Where can people go and watch your film?
So the film is just starting its journey.
Okay.
We had our big Berlinale premiere, which kind of opened up this, and it's quite great to have the opportunity to start in a place with like, you know, quite a big audience, even though this year it's been challenging in many ways. The next stop will be in London. We have our UK premiere at the BFI Flair, which is one of the biggest LGBT festivals in Europe. And we will continue in major festivals, nothing that I can announce right now. But usually what happens is the film will have like a first round of kind of premieres in festivals, and then we will kind of pursue some sort of distribution deal. And more people will be able to watch it either in cinemas or on streaming platforms, basically.
That would be fantastic because, yeah, it is, yeah, an important watch. Okay, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Naemi, and thank you so much for listening. So make sure to subscribe to Film Ireland wherever you get your podcasts.